Okay, so let's get started. First of all, thank you all for your presentations. Also, I thought it was interesting how much durable objects was sort of like featured across these talks. Andreas, did you say that the collaboration here is built on durable objects?
Yes.
Yes. So there's a few questions about that. So let's maybe start with that, and we can talk about.
Before you do, how many levels of this Toddle inception can you go into?
Oh, yeah. So I had to bring in like there's a hard-coded limit of like it only goes 3 levels deep.
Okay, cool.
Because
it would be nice to have a Toddle within a Toddle within a Toddle.
Actually, my LinkedIn banner is a picture of that, of just Toddle going, and it basically just kept going until it crashed.
Cool.
So we had to sort of put in a hard limit of saying you can get to 3 levels, which is the inception rule, right?
Cool.
So you can get to 3 levels and then no more.
Okay, cool. Sorry, honey.
No. Please talk amongst yourselves. We have time. We're just watching here. It's okay. Okay, so the question here, broadly is that does Toddle support real-time collaboration like Figma? Yes, it seems to. If yes, how did you achieve it using which tools and technologies? And maybe I would also then ask, sort of on this, you showed a durable object demo of like basically syncing object from one place to another. But like, what are some of the sort of like real-life challenges around building real-time applications with this? Andreas, would you like to start?
Yeah. So I mean, Toddle does have real-time collaboration. It's not something we've invested very much time in. So we definitely want to do more fancy stuff, like more interaction of live communication. In reality, we never work in real time together, because if I'm working on one feature, the other person's working on something else, and we want that to be separate branches, right? We don't want, like, live collaboration is basically everyone poking around at the same feature, and most of the time what you want is really async collaboration, right? So we do support it, like the updates are shipped. We've got a lot more stuff coming around that. We use, so Toddle is hosted on Cloudflare, which we use both for server-side rendering applications. We use Cloudflare workers for that. We have a lot of data both in key value stores and different types of caching solutions with Cloudflare. And we use durable objects as the sort of immediate backend for the editor. So whenever you're connecting with a WebSocket from Toddle to that object, every single branch has its own unique version that's globally the same, right? So if we're working on the same branch, we have a live collaboration session. If we're working in different branches, we have different sessions, right?
So in this demo that you guys built, for example, how would you handle things like multiple people editing the same state simultaneously on multiple devices?
Yeah, so it was obviously a fairly naive demo where basically just any update would come in and overwrite the previous update. But I think it kind of depends on your application use case. For a lot of cases, actually just the last update winning is enough. So things like Google Docs will have like a central sync server. Every update will go through that, and they're just kind of ordered like that, and that kind of works. But if you want kind of something slightly more dynamic, you can look into CRDTs and things like that, which will be able to reconcile differences, across different devices. And it really just depends on the consistency model your application needs.
And I guess everything bar the final update, the final demo that we showed, similar to what you were saying, it suffices by having some sort of just async updates. It's just making sure that things are synced across the board. It doesn't need to even be on WebSockets, right? It's just having a primitive on the edge where you can store some of that session data and then sync it across different devices. So, there are some use cases, though, where something like a CRDT might make sense.
That makes sense. And then to continue the Toddle example, you said that you typically don't work, synchronously on the same documents. But, how would you prevent overwriting someone else's work? Like, if multiple people are working on the same things. Any diffs tools or visual PR reviews, anything like that?
So for the version of live collaboration we have now, I say it's fairly simple. Like we literally didn't want to add it, but it turned out it was so easy over durable objects that it's almost like, look, I'm going to spend an hour and figure out, can we propagate live, because that would be cool, right? So it wasn't really in the roadmap or anything. It was kind of a side note. As a result, it functions the same way. Like the fact that the time is so fast from you make a change to it propagates, and because it's always local, means that we can actually kind of ignore some of the really deeper problems. But also generally discouraging people from doing a lot of live collaboration because it's not there yet. And the next level is adding in CRDTs to handle some of these sort of collision issues, right?
Yeah, this is a very interesting session. I just came to this conference from Athens where I spoke about durable objects. So this session is very much not sponsored by Cloudflare, but it seems like we're a bunch of enthusiasts here on stage. All right, let's jump into a different topic for a bit. Let me do this one first. How do you like to handle authentication for server-driven UI? Like, are there any particular patterns or problems around that?
I mean, it's very similar to what you would do for any other application. It doesn't really make that much of a difference whether it's server-driven UI or not. It depends on what you're. So let's take the example of personalization here, right? Every single user needs to authenticate, and then they'll have a custom set of layouts that are generated for them specifically. It just means that that logic will be handled by your backend. Now, it's not to say that, oh, you've moved some of this logic to the backend and it's suddenly magically gone from your entire stack. I personally don't believe that. I feel like I like to make the example of the law of conservation of energy and just change that to complexity, which is, you can't magically just destroy complexity. It needs to kind of be shifted from one part of your stack to another. And that's all that's happening here, but in some cases that trade-off is worth taking a lot of that logic that you would previously handle on your front end for that authorization stuff and knowing which things to pull into the layout and just move that over to the back end, and it ends up making your front end code significantly simpler. But in terms of the process, I don't see any major differences there. I don't know if you have anything to add on.
No, I mean, effectively you're making a call to your server from the client, and however you're doing client-server authentication, the same method,
thing,
cookies, headers, MTLS, whatever you want to do.
Makes sense. So, beyond collaboration tools or something where, multiple people are editing the same document, are there any use cases for this kind of sync server states approach? Like here we saw like individual user session being synced between devices. Mm-hmm. Like that's one use case. Yeah. Then in Toddle we see multiple people collaborating in the same document. But what else is this kind of syncing server state approach good for? Are there other patterns that you would recommend it for?
Do you want to go first?
To be honest, I think that kind of covers most applications. You either have a single user session or you have a session shared across multiple users. Yeah, I think that kind of covers most applications, to be honest.
I mean, I think like we were kind of hinting, though, in the talk, those micro interactions can make or break an application. I know a number of times where I've gone into like a modern application and there's syncing issues between the web interface and the mobile interface, and either they're not synced for whatever reason, and there's like minute differences in the UX, and it really messes with your head because you've been conditioned as a user for the last 10 years for all of these things to be personalized and synced across the board, and when it's not, it's blatantly obvious to you that it's not synced. So maybe it's a bit of a stretch, but I would say it's actually like a prerequisite of having a good, modern, and future front-end application. And I'll keep doing that pun until someone laughs.
Nice. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of questions about Toddle, but before we get to those, let me close the chapter on this sort of syncing state thing. I think there might have been some sort of like misunderstanding around the statement that, sort of like edge or durable objects, fixes the issue with the speed of light. And there's a question about, how is propagation of state handled across the globe? How are race conditions handled? How are, does this cause lag or latency or flickering, etc.? But I think there's a different answer to this.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, the speed of light is, you can't get around that. So if you do have a user in Sydney and a user in Helsinki and they need to collaborate with each other, you're going to have some latency. The thing that the edge helps with and things that kind of durable objects help with is primarily the kind of, the user session thing. So if you have multiple devices, your devices are probably close to each other geographically. And so they'll be talking to the same server very close to them. And that will kind of fix the speed of light problem there. Or if you have, a bunch of people in an office collaborating, or you have a bunch of people geographically collaborating, or a bunch of people in a chat room, say, that are geographically relatively close, this will fix the speed of light issue there. But fundamentally, if you have someone in Australia and someone in, New York that need to talk to each other, there's going to have to be a round trip there. We can't really get around the laws of physics, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Because obviously we use durable objects and had a bit of the same question, but I think what I think is the coolest part of durable objects is the fact that it's not centered around a data center. And it'll dynamically relocate that object if it sees that to make sense. So the fact that we live in different time zones actually solves part of the problem. Because you say when your team in Australia is working on something, well, they're going to be roughly, like they're not going to be an exact opposite side of the planet because they're probably asleep, right? So in reality, it does always move it. And that object, if it figures out that it's not in the closest data center to all of the connections, it'll relocate that object to a different data center dynamically, right?
Samuel, is that something that's available now? I remember when I last looked into this, that was more like a documented.
I'm actually not sure if that's available yet.
Yeah,
I have to double check that.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to.
It's on your marketing page.
No, exactly.
It was definitely in the initial blog post.
So
this
is where
on the website.
This is where I prove that Cloudflare is not sponsoring me or this session. Sometimes their marketing can be a little ahead of the implementation. Yeah, which is, of course, undesirable, but sometimes happens. Okay, let me do a few quick fire questions about Toddle. We have a lot of these, so we can sort of go quickly. So firstly, how does Toddle handle accessibility? Like, is there any affordance, like particular affordances for accessibility?
So the short answer is it handles it kind of the same way that HTML does, is then you have the full power to do all of it, but right now we don't really do much for you. So it's one of their, building a tool like this, there's always a million things you could add in. Like you now have this platform to build incredible, useful tools into your workflow. And I mean, accessibility is one of those, right? Validating, first of all, just basic validation in real time, showing you, you added an image and it's lagging an old attribute or anything like that. But there's a lot of places we can take that. So we have big plans, but we also have a team with a long list of priorities. So right now, it's the same way as if you're working with anything else. We're kind of, for the moment, leaving in your hands. But you have all the same flexibility. Like you can do anything in HTML or in Toddle that you can do in HTML to add this kind of thing. Right?
And what about internationalization? Is that something that you support in Toddle? Like if you have different UI languages for different...
Yeah, the editor is not localized in any way, so that's very much still English. But the applications you can build, and again, like Toddle very much just piggybacks off the web standard whenever possible, right? We kind of have a principle of we're not going to change it unless we can make something that's like a lot better, right? So if you want to build in internationalization, you can use all the same APIs that are available in the browser. You can use whatever third-party system for internationalization. We use Contentful for our blog, etc., and it has pretty good internationalization and localization support. Maybe not according to the TC39 people working on that. I think their level is a little bit above what everybody else is doing, but for the common folk, I think they do really well. Right?
So the solution is to load the UI content text from a CMS? Yeah. Makes sense. Okay, one more question about basic hygiene stuff. So testing, how do you, test Toddle applications or applications built with Toddle?
Yeah. So this is a really good question. We get it quite a lot, and we don't have anything built in around testing. And obviously, you could use any automated testing system. Like at the end, it spits out a web application, so you can run anything you want against that to verify. What we found is that we didn't need it as much as we thought we would. So we are still obviously testing a lot of things. We have some automation in place for verifying. But the fact that you got this instant feedback, not just when working with the UI, but also when working with formulas. Like it's very comparable to programming with a REBL, which is, depending on what language you've worked in, is either completely foreign to you or completely standard. But this idea of for every line of code you write, it evaluates that and shows the result. And Toddle works the same way with live data. So every time you update a formula, it'll show you the output and essentially run that through. And that actually means that a lot of the normal unit testing you would do to sort of verify as you go becomes less relevant.
All right, a few more Toddle quick fires and then we'll go back to server-driven UI. So is the working area in Toddle an iframe?
Yes, it is.
Great, that was quick. I like that. Let's keep that pace. Yeah, a lot of compliments about the dog fooding, which I also I'm very impressed by.
I would actually like to talk about, because the funny thing is that it almost sometimes sounds a little bit like a gimmick. But the point of that wasn't really hear everyone see what Toddle can do. It was actually that I was getting to a point where I felt like I had something that worked. This is way before Toddle became a company, right? I felt I had something that worked and I could do demos. But you're always sort of in this but does this idea scale? What happens if I'm building something large? And so it really started with me trying to prove to myself that Toddle worked before anyone else.
It also happens to be an absolutely killer demo, just the benefit. Yeah. Okay, so how vendor locked am I if I use Toddle? Like, of course, the UI itself is, bespoke, but like the output that it creates, can I then start to hand edit it and etc.?
Yeah, so Toddle does not generate code in any sort of readable format. Like right now, it's more of an interpreted language. It's easier to see Toddle as a bespoke programming language with the output of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But those things are, at the moment, interpreted by a runtime in the browser and not actually spit out to a final result. So at the moment, you can only run Toddle applications through our, that are hosted by us. We are looking at changing that going forward so that you can also self-host your applications. So that's something we'll announce at some point this year. We also support exporting, any component, like the date picker you can see, can also be pulled in as a web component. So every component built in Toddle is compatible here, and you can just grab that into your existing JavaScript or whatever environment you're running in. And as such, let's say you wanted to move off Toddle, or even better onto Toddle. You can do that gradually by basically saying, I'm going to start adding in more and more, move more of my app over to this Toddle web components, and eventually then go and say, now I'm going to actually switch it over, right?
Nice. So just to confirm, since this answers a question here, you can publish just components from Toddle and integrate them into an existing code base, so the whole app doesn't need to be built in Toddle.
No, it doesn't. And we have a lot of users actually that are mostly doing, a lot of agencies that are doing a lot of Webflow sites for their customers, but are hitting these limitations of what Webflow can do. And this ability to just drop in a web component built in Toddle that basically solves everything for that particular area, so it makes their life a lot easier. Right?
All right, that's nice. Now let's give Andreas a moment to breathe from all that quick fire and then go back to the server-driven UI stuff. Firstly, were you trying to indicate me that you have an answer from the team?
I do. Unfortunately, durable object relocation is not yet available, although it is planned for the future.
Yes, maybe you can. Somebody can open a PR the documentation.
It is in the documentation. It is in the public docs.
Okay, great. Makes sense.
Admittedly, it's a footnote, but still.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, but that's funny though, because I remember the first time I heard about durable objects, I also had the impression that that feature was available, and so I don't know, it's kind of stuck into the zeitgeist. Okay, so back to server-driven UI. There's one question which I really like, which is, would server-driven UI benefit from a new type of tooling to support this type of development? What is the real sort of state of the art in terms of you want to build apps like that? What tools do you use, and what is sort of needed? What's the gap?
I think in practice, what you often see it is people use sort of headless CMSs for that type of thing, and they just output the data in the right format and then architect their code base around that output, and they defined their component boundaries well in that space. I've thought a lot about this, especially around mobile development, because this server-driven UI concept gets a tad bit more complicated when you're dealing with mobile apps, because you can kind of render native components in any layout that you want, but then you're dealing in the mobile world with bundles being out of date. So you have a version of the app that doesn't support a new component, and your server's telling it, render this component, but that component doesn't exist in version 1 of the app, but you launched it in version 2 of the app. So it gets a lot more complex, and ultimately what I've landed on is there's a real good opportunity for some CMS to come here and become sort of server-driven UI first and mobile first in that capacity, and handle some of these edge cases, some of these slight behavior differences that you might exist. I mean, one common reason that, let's say, Airbnb uses server-driven UI is because they've ditched cross-platform as a technology, and they've actually decided we're going to abstract a lot of that behind into the server-driven UI space. So they have very similar looking components, but they're written in different technologies, but they can still handle the layouting together. I think there is probably a space for tooling, but it oftentimes ends up being that people build it bespoke, and it's not standardized, and there's a lot of edge cases around it. So that's kind of where my head is with that. RSCs are an interesting one as well. So I've gone into a little bit more detail in another talk where I go just into server-driven UI, and RSCs are actually, I think, a subset of server-driven UI. So the whole concept of server components is in itself, when you just tell that story individually, it's not actually a very comprehensible, understandable story. But I think when you put it in the context of server-driven UI, it actually starts to make a lot more sense.
Yeah, we actually have a specific question about that, which is that, instead of home rolling, on the client, the rendering framework for server-driven UI and then like the JSON payload format, could you implement this on top of React Server Components payloads? Yeah.
So the way that I look at it is right now, and I'll try to go through this as quickly as I can. Right now, what you're doing is you're computing a lot on the server, and you're calculating all of those layouts, but then adding all of the props and the data that's necessary to render your full page, and then sending that through one big JSON blob. Okay, that's a lot of data to compute on the server before you send that response back. So your FCP and your TTI are going to be not very good. So what can you do to combat that? Well, what if you just sent the layout only, and then each component was responsible for individually fetching its own data, and that could potentially be a good optimization, and so you can start streaming in components. All right, what if we take it one step further? The next step that we can do it is, what if we just fetch those data for each of these individual components on the server individually, made a database call, and then serialized and sent those components that were rendered on the server across the board. And I think that's where it fits into the story. It's like the end state optimization. But then you still need some level of flexibility in terms of the layouting and which components get rendered where. And I actually think when you use server-driven UI plus RSCs, it helps set the component boundaries quite nicely, because you have to think about that, and you don't make the mistake of accidentally converting your entire tree to client components because you've put a use client somewhere far up and you've not thought about how you lay out these components together. So I think they go very much hand in hand, and it's just a continuation of one another.
Yeah, I think, to sort of like, just to riff off that point, I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but hopefully you have something to add to this, maybe Samuel. Because, Cloudflare seems to think durable objects is like a data product or a storage product. I mean, if you go to the Mark website, you need to go to the storage category and find it under there, next to D1 and R2 and, R3 and all that, R2. But then for me, it's a compute product, right? Like it's you deploy your custom code that lives in the same place where the synchronous state exists, which actually gives it like an interesting quality where, like the code and data sort of like coexist in like a very, like an easy to think about program way. So could a durable object be your, essentially your RSC server, your React component, server component server, where the logic is co-located with the state that is actually shared between the clients?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I saw on Twitter that Sunil had managed to get the Remix server running in a durable object the other week, as pretty much that same thing, rendering RSCs in a durable object. But I think one thing that server-driven UI kind of falls down in is that the name is server-driven UI, which implies there's this server-client boundary. But really, it's about kind of separating the layout data from the layout code. And it doesn't really matter if that happens on the client or in a server, in a durable object, or whatever. It's more that you can kind of change the layout logic on the fly, almost. So even if you're rendering it as RSCs in a durable object, it's still that same kind of separation.
All right, that makes sense. I'm going to do one more question regarding, sort of Cloudflare durable object-y things, and then we can hop on to a different topic. So this question, which I hope you understand, is how different is the edge approach from cloud-indexed databases? So I'm assuming this is something to do with replication, like to different cloud locations.
I'll be honest, I have no idea what cloud index databases means.
All right, I don't really know this either. Does anybody? Do you want to specify what are cloud index databases? Anonymous. Oh yeah. Right. Did you hear the question? Okay, I will repeat to the best of my abilities. So basically, in the same way as you have like IndexedDB in the browser, there are some data sync solutions that you run these IndexedDBs in the cloud, and then you sync the state from between client and a server. And this seems like it's a very similar approach to as what you've implemented.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds very similar. Durable objects are kind of more of a primitive than a high-level product, and so you can absolutely build that type of thing on top of durable objects.
Nice. If we didn't get the answer quite right, you can come and ask afterwards. All right. let's see. Let's do another Toddle quickfire round. We tried to put these themes sort of like in a thematic way where we would have a lot of shared things, but Toddle turned out to be such a very specific, topic that I feel like our esteemed colleagues here can't really have a lot to say about it. I think you're the ultimate expert. So
It's great. That's all I can say about it.
Yes. Let's do this.
I mean, we can make up some answers if that's helpful.
Yeah, let's say, yeah. Okay, so for every Toddle answer, I want Samuel to also make up an answer.
Good.
Okay, great. So yeah, how well does Toddle handle version controlling? Is it built on Git or other version control approach, or?
Do you want to?
Yeah, so Toddle has excellent support for subversion, and it's really key that we go back to our roots.
Yeah, Samuel is like a large.
Close. So this sort of was a long rabbit hole at the time because obviously I knew right away that I needed version control like Git, and I spent a lot of time hoping that Git would be the solution, but I never found a way to make Git entirely run with a custom diff algorithm. And since Toddle essentially stores everything as large JSON documents, I needed a custom algorithm for diffing, and as a result I ended up having to do a whole custom version control system. So it is based on me spending almost a month diving into how Git actually works, which is a fun month to use, by the way. Definitely recommend it. And then essentially replicating all the same starter logic in procedural SQL in Superbase. So it's running in stored procedures in Superbase version of Git.
That sounds insane.
I really had to tell myself many, many times, there's no way this is the smartest idea, but...
And you're trying to convince people to put their data on this? Maybe you shouldn't tell them all of this.
It's the Superbase going to eat it all. It's the future. No, so the real reason was the basic idea of this sort of blockchain, if you will, approach of how Git stores, where every commit references the previous one, and actually finding out what the common shared ancestor is based on walking back this chain of commit hashes or commit shares. Really means that doing a traditional lookup and trying to find out what's the common ancestor actually becomes quite difficult. So you either need to fetch an enormous amount of data or you need to make like a lot of requests. And Toddle, you never really have to worry about commits. We don't ask you to commit. What it does is actually runs on a 10-second automatic timer. So any updates you do within a 10-second window gets bashed into a commit. That also means we have a lot of commits, and performance is something we have to take care about, right? And the fact is that a stored procedure can just do a ton of really quick fire database lookups to do things like finding common ancestors.
I mean, it sounds like you've kind of implemented a version of event sourcing for, like, you can create the state of a Toddle application through a bunch of events that are stored in a database by replaying them to some degree, right?
Almost. So Git isn't quite event sourcing because it never actually, it doesn't store the diff. It stores the, whenever you update a file, it'll store the new file, but then the actual whole file structure tree
can be compared.
So if I'm changing one file, it'll essentially, I can have a whole new snapshot of my files, but for that new snapshot just points to the old version of all the other files, right?
But do you keep the snapshot runs? Like, could you revert to any arbitrary old version in the history?
I can go back to pretty much when the Toddle editor started. Yeah.
Nice.
Our
branching?
UI for this and our tooling for this is still very basic, right? So we're going to add a lot more, but the underlying technology allows us to do all this, right?
Do you want to go first?
What about branching and like different branches per user?
So you can have as many branches as you want. Right now, we added in a limit where you can only branch off the main. So we don't really support full Git style branching. And again, that's something we could add, but we did it a little bit intentional as in saying, let's try and push people in one direction. A lot of our users are also not programmers. So there is a little bit of a case that if you give them complete free range, you're adding a lot of support for yourself. So there's some times where we sort of held back and say, like, I don't think we need this. I don't think this is necessary. And I think trunk-based development in most cases has sort of been accepted as the norm anyway. So that's the only thing we allow for now. If we figure out there's a reason to add, like, more freedom around branch creation, then we can add that in.
one thing you mentioned, performance, just a couple minutes ago. I'm curious as to like the exported code. If you run any benchmarks on comparing a React app that's built or whatever other framework with the code that you've generated from Core Web Vitals, Lighthouse Score, like how does it perform? I guess comparatively.
We haven't done any like real one-to-one studies. But generally, I like to say the performance is quite similar to Next plus React.
Okay.
And of course, there's a million different ways that can differ based on how you build either of those things.
And is it all going to be client-side, or can you move part of it to be server-rendered before or statically generated ahead of time?
So we do server-side rendering of everything.
Okay.
All the pages. You can then pick in whether you want like specific APIs to be part of that server-side rendering.
Okay.
So maybe I want this to be fetched, this data to be fetched on the server as part of that rendering, or maybe I specifically don't. Like if you have APIs that you know are slow, it might make sense to render it first and then go and do the request afterwards, right? So the user's not hang.
Cool.
But so everything is server-side rendering. There's still a lot of opportunities for optimizing. Like basically Quick, I think, is leading the way on what this strategy should be. And one of the nice things about having a bespoke program language is that Toddle, the language features underneath are really, really simple. Like there's not that many things you can do because we don't need syntactic sugar when there's no syntax. So it's a very, very simple language, and as a result, optimizing it is generally a lot easier than like JavaScript, which is a terrible language to try and optimize for. Right? Like that, literally, as I say, there's a lot of PhD student bodies that's been thrown on that fire.
So speaking of the language, like how powerful is it, like in terms of like conditionals? There's a question here, like does it have feature flags and A/B testing? So I'm assuming if you use a third-party A/B testing framework, you can integrate that. But like, can you render completely different types of content or app dynamically based on,
Yeah, I mean, in terms of flexibility, the easiest way to think of it is probably something like a framework like React, right? And it actually has a lot of the same both capabilities and limitations, right? There are things that React doesn't do, where you go, I'm going to go and write this in JavaScript that has nothing to do with React, right? And Toddle is in many ways the same way. There's a lot of browser APIs that are not natively supported, but it's really easy to write a module or package that uses those, and now you can use them in Toddle, right? So I think in many ways those are kind of, like there's more or less a one-to-one. And in terms of capabilities, the most complex project I've ever built in my life, without any close second, is Toddle. Like that, the complexity of that application, I think we did count it. Like worst case, we sometimes have 2,000 components on the screen at the same time. If you're the person that like opening everything on a large app, right? Like there's just a lot, and it's all dynamic because the whole side tree of everything, like that depends on the data you're loading. Like almost every part of it is extremely dynamic, and there's a ton of components working there. So it really does give you the flexibility to build like anything you can imagine. And again, limitations are similar to React. Like if you want to build stuff in Canvas, generally it's not React. Like with the asterisks, of course someone built that. But generally, it's outside of the sort of realm, right?
Nice. Well, we do have a few more questions, but we don't have time to get through all of them. So I'm just going to ask the one that I am the most curious about, and then we'll finish on that. Why is it called Toddle?
I don't know. My wife came up with the name, and I had gone through a million different ideas of what I wanted to call it. My daughter's suggestion was finmad med flæskesteg, which is Danish and mean a fig sandwich with pork. And they were like, okay, I like this idea. This is good. She was 4 at the time.
Okay, that makes more sense.
So I like this idea. It's like, okay, but that's a bit long. What if we reduce it down? And I realized, damn it, Figma beat me to it. So we ended up with Toddle as a name. There was an early version where I wanted to call it Web 3, because I had this idea that it would be like, we had Web 2 where everything is built by Facebook, and then Web 3 is like now more people can build, and then it turns out someone kind of hijacked that.
Yeah, it's always a little too late to get names.
Maybe it's Web 4 would
Maybe you should call it Google. Okay. All right. Well, that was all we had time for. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for all the questions and participation. Let's go have some coffee, and we'll be back here in a half an hour. Thank you very much.